Hey everyone, ready to geek out on some serious automotive legend?
It's amazing how a car shrouded in so much mystery managed to capture the hearts and minds of enthusiasts globally.
Right, like trying to get your hands on a unicorn. But thankfully, you've sent over a fantastic stash of Intel detailed technical documents, in Spanish no less, and a Cars and Bids YouTube episode with Doug DeMuro checking out a midnight purple R34 V-Spec.
Talk about a dynamic duo of sources. We get the down and dirty specs alongside a passionate, real-world review.
Perfect combo. So before we get lost in a sea of spoilers and turbos, let's rewind a bit.
Yeah.
What exactly is so special about this car? Why all the hype?
Well, you've got to understand, the R34 Skyline GT-R wasn't just a one-hit wonder. It carries the legacy of a lineage that stretches back to the late 60s. The R32, launched in '89, reignited the GT-R flame, and the R34, hitting the scene in '99, became this swan song, the last of the Skyline-based GT-Rs.
Whoa, the last of its kind. No wonder it holds such legendary status.
Absolutely. And to add fuel to the fire, only around 11,500 units were ever produced. Talk about exclusivity.
Okay, that explains the rarity factor, but what about the performance? I mean, this car is always depicted as this powerhouse, even back in the day with the infamous gentleman's agreement among Japanese automakers. Didn't they all agree to cap horsepower at 276, even though everyone knew these cars were capable of way more?
You're exactly right. And you know what's fascinating? Doug, from Cars and Bids, actually mentions having an R32 that effortlessly churned out close to 320 horsepower.
So those video games weren't exaggerating, but how? What made that possible?
It's all thanks to the legendary RB26 DETT engine, the beating heart of these cars. This engine was practically built for modifications, and the tuning scene back then, let's just say it was a match made in horsepower heaven.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. You mentioned the V-Spec trim, which is what we see in the video. What made it the top dog?
Imagine taking an already phenomenal car and injecting it with pure performance adrenaline. The V-Spec was all about those little extras that made a world of difference. It had an active rear limited slip differential, which in layman's terms means it could transfer power between the rear wheels more effectively, making for insane traction and cornering.
And then there's the Atessa ETS Pro AWD system.
Right.
That's got to be one of the coolest sounding acronyms in car history.
Yeah, definitely up there.
What's the deal with that?
It's like some out of science fiction. But what it boils down to is advanced all-wheel drive.
Okay.
This system could actually predict what the car was going to do next based on driver input and road conditions.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it could send power to the wheels that needed it most, making for crazy levels of grip and handling.
So it was smart.
Yeah, very smart, especially for its time.
It's a big part of what makes the R34 feel so planted and responsive, right?
Exactly. And let's not forget about those upgrades to the suspension and aero.
Right.
The V-Spec came with a stiffer suspension setup for sharper handling, and those aggressive aero bits, like the front splitter and rear diffuser.
Oh, yeah. Gotta love those spoilers and diffusers.
They do look cool.
They just scream, this car is not messing around.
They definitely add to the whole mystique.
Right.
And of course, they serve a purpose, helping to keep the car glued to the road at high speeds.
Speaking of mystique, can we talk about that midnight purple paint job on the V-Spec Doug's reviewing?
Oh, yeah.
It's like staring into a galaxy, constantly shifting and shimmering.
It's gorgeous, that color-shifting paint,
Yeah.
which can look purple, blue, even green, depending on the light, was a factory option, but a rare one at that.
Wow.
It really exemplifies the unique approach JDM manufacturers had to car colors, often vibrant, playful, almost defiant, compared to what we are used to seeing elsewhere.
It's like they knew these cars were going to be rolling pieces of art.
For sure.
But let's get back under the hood for a sec. Our Spanish document gets pretty deep into the engine, mentioning different variations of that iconic RB26 DETT.
Right.
What's the story there?
So the basic architecture of the engine remained consistent, but the output varied slightly depending on the year and trim level.
Okay.
This actually speaks volumes about how well engineered and robust this engine was. It could handle some serious power, especially with a little help from the aftermarket tuning scene.
You mentioned tuning earlier.
Yeah.
Did the document touch on that at all?
It did. It dives into the availability of Nismo parts.
Yeah.
You know, Nissan's motorsport division.
Right.
They offered a whole catalog of factory-developed upgrades for these cars.
Wow.
We're talking exhausts, intercoolers, suspension components, differentials, you name it. Essentially, Nissan was giving enthusiasts a way to squeeze even more performance out of these already incredible machines.
So even Nissan was in on the whole make it faster game.
Exactly.
But for the longest time, actually getting your hands on an R34 in places like the US was next to impossible.
Right.
It was like this forbidden fruit that everyone knew about, but few ever got to taste.
And that's where the show display law comes in, which the document actually mentions.
Okay.
A handful of R34s managed to slip into the U.S. before the 25-year import rule, all thanks to this law.
So they could get around it.
Yeah, you could say that.
Interesting.
Basically, it allows for the import of cars that are deemed historically or technologically significant, but there's a catch.
Okay, there's always a catch.
Well, these cars are hit with a strict mileage limit, just 2,500 miles per year.
Oh, I see.
So yeah, you could import an R34, but you couldn't exactly use it as a daily driver.
Right.
More like a piece of automotive art that you admire from afar.
That's ironic, considering Doug in the video actually highlights the R34's practicality.
Oh, wow. So
He was raving about the usable back seats and decent trunk space.
really?
It's not every day you see a legendary performance car that you could, in theory, take the family out for a spin in.
Not at all.
Interesting how they found that balance.
Exactly. And that speaks to the design philosophy behind the R34.
Okay.
It wasn't meant to be just a track weapon.
Right.
It was intended to be a car that could handle both worlds, high performance and everyday usability.
The best of both worlds.
Yes, exactly.
It's that perfect blend of raw power and unexpected practicality that seems to make the R34 so appealing, even decades later. I can see why people love it so much.
And speaking of unexpected, Doug also comments on the R34's surprisingly basic interior,
Oh, really?
which some might find surprising.
Interesting.
But again, it goes back to the design ethos of the time substance over style.
Okay.
It's like they poured all their energy into how the car drove, not just how fancy the cabin looked.
So it's all business on the outside and even more business on the inside.
Precisely. No fancy infotainment screens, no overly complicated controls.
Wow.
Just a driver, a steering wheel, and a whole lot of car to wrangle.
Which makes the video host's final thoughts even more interesting because he seems absolutely blown away by the R34's analog feel, that raw, unfiltered connection between driver and machine.
Right, there's something so special about that.
It's like stepping back in time to an era when driving was purely about the visceral experience, the mechanical symphony of the engine, the feedback through the steering wheel, the sense of speed that's unadulterated by electronic nannies.
Yeah, it's definitely a different kind of driving experience.
You're painting a pretty tempting picture here. So how does Doug sum up his experience? What's the final verdict on this automotive icon?
Well, he gives the R34 a score of 60 out of 100.
Okay.
Which he's quick to clarify isn't a negative reflection of the car itself.
Right.
He emphasizes that it's more about acknowledging the R34's legendary status and the near impossible task of assigning a purely objective rating to a car like this.
It's like trying to put a price tag on a piece of history.
Right.
Some things are just beyond numerical evaluation.
Exactly. It's about the feeling, the experience, the weight of what the car represents.
You can't quantify that.
It transcends spreadsheets and spec sheets.
It's about passion, heritage, and that undeniable cool factor.
Absolutely. And it gets you thinking, doesn't it? About the power of nostalgia, especially when it comes to cars.
Oh, yeah.
How much of our perception is shaped by the time and place we first encountered these machines?
Nostalgia is a powerful force.
It really is.
It can transport you back to those formative years, those early days of car obsession, those Gran Turismo marathons with friends.
Exactly.
Makes you wonder what the forbidden fruit cars of today are, you know?
That's a good question.
What will be the R34 of the next generation?
Right. What cars will inspire that same sense of longing and awe?
The car is destined for legendary status, fueled by video game fantasies, YouTube deep dives, and whispered rumors in online forums.
It's fascinating to think about.
It really is.
It speaks to this fascinating and constantly evolving relationship between cars and popular culture, a relationship the R34 embodies perfectly.
And hey, if you ever need proof of that, just look at that little detail. Doug pointed out the spare pair of glasses in the glove compartment.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
I bet they belong to someone who spent countless hours behind a screen racing a digital R34 long before they ever got to experience the real deal.
What a perfect detail to end on. It's those little glimpses behind the curtain that make this car and this entire deep dive so captivating.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Until next time, keep those engines revving.